Welcome back to the Center of Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger K. Green, and this is going to be a lecture on Book 6 of Homer's Odyssey for our ongoing class, Homer and the Critique of Western Civilization. At the end of Book 5, I in my lecture on Book 5, I was mentioning that, look, this kind of descent from the gods that we see between Odysseus and the women, especially that he is interested in, or that are interested in him, or that help him in some sort of way, right? So starting with Athena from the very beginning, and then we had Calypso, the nymph, and then we had Ino, and now we have the princess and the stranger here. So we do open up the book with Athena again, and there's that kind of recapping going on, as I said, in the beginning of the contextualized reading for Book 5. So there he lay at rest, the storm-tossed great Odysseus, I almost said Ulysses, borne down by his hard labors first and now deep sleep, as Athena traveled through the countryside and reached the Phaeacian city. Years ago they lived in a land of spacious dancing circles, Hyperia, all too close to the overbearing Cyclops, stronger, violent brutes who harried them without end. So their godlike king, Nausithous, led the people in a vast migration, settled them in Scheria, far from the men who toil on this earth. He flung up walls around the city, built the houses, raised the gods' temples, and shared the land for plowing. Now, just because this course is about the Odyssey and Western civilization, I think that it's interesting to note that the Phaeacians are definitely overtly compared to this kind of in-between state between gods and mortals as well. And they're being distinguished right away from this other, quote, race of people. And I should say a little bit more about that. The Cyclopses, though. In the ancient world, the concept of race does exist, but it seems to mean something more like just like a nation or generic. It's not, as I've said in some other lectures recently, if you've watched the race lecture in relation to Western civilization, I mention it there. So the concept of race in the ancient world is not biologically based, and it's not based on skin color, but as I said in my longer lecture, concepts of race transform and change over time. And so if we're looking at embedded forms of racism in Western civilization, or what might be carried with us, if we are looking back at the long history, right, back to this early piece of literature, and really earliest in some ways in a piece of literature, especially in its completeness and in its epic form, the Odyssey. So there are things I want to sort of be very attentive to as we look in this chapter about how the book naturalizes and frames the notion of what we might call, in present day speak, civilization. And so this seems to be what characterizes the Phaeacians, is that, so not only are they different from the Cyclops, but the Cyclopses are brutes who harried them without end. And so they Nausithous moves his people, and then builds this city, but they're at the edges of the human world, right? So we'll see as we move through the book here. The text says that now Alcinous ruled, and the gods made him wise. Straight to his house the clear-eyed Pallas went, full of plans for great Odysseus' journey home. She made her way to the gaily painted room where a young girl lay asleep, a match for the deathless gods in build and beauty. Nausicaa the daughter of generous King Alcinous. 2 handmaids, fair as the Graces, slept beside her, flanking the 2 posts, with the gleaming doors closed. But the goddess drifted through like a breath of fresh air, rushed into the girl's bed and hovered close. She spoke, in a face and form like the shipman Dymas's daughter, a girl the princess's age and dearest to her heart. Disguised, the bright-eyed goddess chided, Nausicaa, how could your mother bear a careless girl like you? Look at your fine clothes lying here neglected, with your marriage not far off. The day you should be decked in all your glory and offer elegant dress to those who form your escort. That's how a bride's good name goes out into the world, and it brings her father and queenly mother joy. Come, let's go wash these clothes at the break of day. I'll help you, lend a hand, and the work will fly. You won't stay unwed long. The noblest men in the country court you now, all Phaeacians just like you, Phaeacia born and raised. So come, the first thing in the morning, press your kingly father to harness the mules and wagon for you, all to carry your sashes, dresses, glossy spreads for your bed. It's so much nicer for you to ride than to go on foot. The washing pools are just too far from town. Okay, so a lot going on here. Of course, Athena is working on Odysseus' behalf, as always. But what we get with Nausicaa is this, she's the princess, so she's royalty, and she is of the Phaeacians, who are kind of almost, they are mortals, but they are often compared to the gods, and that there's something close to the gods about them. We are seeing a lot of marriage in this chapter, and we learn quite a bit about what a woman is supposed to do here. Now, you might note that one of the things she's supposed to do is the washing, but it's not that Nausicaa has to do all the washing herself. We'll see that she has servants for that as the chapter moves on. But there's a lot going on in terms of gender roles, and there's a lot of expectation being built around a possible wedding. Now, we, of course, the readers, know that Odysseus is taken, but what this does show is that there's a kind of monogamy that is respected, at least in terms of marriage, in this ancient Greek culture. And as we think about marriage in this society, I want to mention that that marriage as we know it today is quite different. If we think about, I often characterize the culture I live in as Euro-Christian culture, right? Which is a social movement and not a religion, right? So I'm not particularly a Christian by faith, but I would still be a Euro-Christian. Colloquially, we can also say that Euro-Christians are, quote, white people. But we know that even whiteness doesn't, the way that people talk, just think about comedians and jokes and terms like derogatory terms. So whiteness is a kind of affect. It's not necessarily just skin color. But that's one of the reasons why I use the term Euro-Christian. But if that term is new to you and you want the quick version of it, you can just say that white or European, but European Christian formed, because you couldn't dissect Christianity from politics and the ways that I am talking about cultural influences. So in 1215, for example, there is the Fourth Lateran Council in Europe, and with that, there were marriages, so poor people would get married before that time, but it wouldn't necessarily be tracked by the church. But there's a lot of work going on to try and unify the church, during the 1200s, and there's a lot of socialized control that's developing. So in 1215, for example, we get the first laws that say that Jews have to wear different colored clothing or different kinds of clothing to mark them out. And not just Jews, but Muslims as well. And that, of course, we know will return in the 20th century when the National Socialists or the Nazis made Jewish people wear stars because they saw themselves as improving upon this long history of European civilization. And of course, the right wing in the United States that I live in today still often uses the rhetoric of Western civilization to hold up things, and the idea that white people or that Christianity is being oppressed, or that white people, there's a white genocide. So these kinds of myths come from the right wing movements, and we can see it across other political movements that are far right. Although in my culture, everybody likes to easily use the word fascist when the fascist has just become this word that means for Americans that they don't like the other person's politics, without much historical background on where that term comes from in Italy in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, right? And then really kind of fully coming to its form in fascist Italy in the early 1920s is where that term comes from. But those terms get used loosely, and I'm not going to lecture a long time on that. But I will say that embedded within the defenders of so-called Western civilization are many racialized ideas. The Nazis did not persecute the Jews, for example, or try to exterminate them because they were a different religion. The Jews were considered to be a different race. So race is fluid. People who were not considered race of a certain race become another race. So like Italian people in the United States were not considered to be white until into the 20th century, nor were Irish people who have very white skin in the in the mid 19th century, right? Race is such a complex idea, and then we have the pseudoscience of the 19th century on top of it. But we know that it's a social construct and that it changes over time. That's kind of one of the main elements I want to just have in mind here as we move through this lecture. Okay, so we move on. So what we're getting then as listeners, because we know what's going to happen in the story, right? We're getting a lot of other information as Odysseus goes and visits these different types of people. They're always being compared to him and his people who he's on his way home to, right? So we're getting kind of a tour of the world through his journey, or at least the Mediterranean world of about 700 to 800 years before the current era. So after Athena has spoken these words in the ear of the sleeping Nausicaa, she moves back to Mount Olympus. And so there's this movement of the gods again. We've kind of seen that happens a lot at the beginnings of the books. There Athena went once the bright-eyed had urged the princess on. Down soon rose her splendid throne and woke Nausicaa finely gowned. Dawn soon rose and on her splendid throne and woke Nausicaa finely down. And so there's another kind of different phrase for dawn than the rosy red fingers. So that might be a memory device for the oral poets too. So she's still been beguiled in the dream, and that's another sort of, I think, theme in this book is the dreaminess or wakenness or mistiness, as we'll see with Odysseus, that the gods can come in and they can move and make us not recognize one another, but they speak through us in terms of giving us courage or giving us the right words to say at a time. And she goes to her daddy. She says, "Daddy dear," in this translation. I wonder, won't you have them harness a wagon for me, the tall one with the good smooth wheels, so I can take out our clothes to the river for washing? Lovely things, but lying before me all soiled, and you yourself sitting among the princes, debating points at your council. You really should be wearing spotless linen. Then you have 5 sons, full grown in the palace, 2 of them married, but 3 are lusty bachelors, always demanding crisp shirts fresh from the wash when they go out to dance. Look at my duties that all rest on that all rests on me. And so this seems like she's being like a good daughter, right? Like a good teenager. I'm going to do the chores for the day, and I'll do your washing too. And she wants something else as well. And the next passage says that her father sees right through her. She was cautious not to mention that the reason why she's really doing this is she wants to catch a man, right? To become to her husband. And so he says, "Off you go. Yes, of course you can have the mules." With that, he called the stablemen, and they complied. And so again, what we see in the story is there are servants that are there always behind and just around and ready at hand, whether it's handmaids so far, whether it's the stablemen. And then at the end of that next passage, right? So around 95 or line 95, then taking the whip in the hands and glistening reins, she touched the mules to a start, and out they clattered, trotting on at a clip, bearing the princess and her clothes, and not alone. Her maids went with her, stepping briskly too. So she's riding on the wagon, and her maids are coming too to help, and they walk along beside her. And then the poet here in the next passage compares again the princess Nausicaa with Artemis, the goddess. And Artemis is the goddess of the hunt and also a virgin, always a virgin, right? So it's an interesting comparison, and that should be giving us some information as well. So we get in the intertext here, right? White-armed Nausicaa led the singing, dancing beat, as lithe as Artemis, with her arrows striding down from a high peak, Taygetus's towering ridge, or Erymanthus, thrilled to race with the wild boar or bounding deer, and the nymphs of the hills race with her, daughters of Zeus, whose shield is storm and thunder, ranging the hills in sport, and Leto's heart exults as head and shoulders over the rest her daughter rises, unmistakable. She outshines them all, though all are lovely. So this is a really interesting passage because it's not just that Nausicaa is being compared to Artemis, but her servants are being compared to nymphs. So everybody kind of rises in status in the Phaeacian land. And then Leto is Artemis's mother, also Apollo's mother. And so she gets mentioned here. And so what we see is this image that the poet has conjured for us of this beautiful daughter who's going out, and she's so dutiful, but she's doing this thing. And it's strange that it's compared to the hunt, but of course, of what's at hand here is it's the hunt of love, right? It's the hunt for a man is what she's doing. And that the mother sees it and approves and looks on. So there's a lot of family warmth going on. And so this is all, that's all a long simile, this comparison to Artemis. And then the passage says, "So Nausicaa shone among her maids, a virgin still unwed." So the text is very clear about her state of matrimony. And then I want us to think about, I say the cinematography, or like the cinematic type of images that the poet gives us throughout the Odyssey, and look at this image of like the princess is playing, ball with her maids, and then the ball sort of goes off and goes in the weeds, and someone comes after looking at the ball, and the ball wakes up Odysseus. And we've just seen things like that in storytelling, and even in the 21st century, right? That storytelling is, that device is already in the oldest of Western literature. So the ball wakes great Odysseus, and then he says this, he starts up and he says, "Man of misery, whose land have I lit on now? What are they here? Violent, savage, lawless, or friendly to strangers, God-fearing men? Listen, shouting, echoing round me, women, girls, or the nymphs who haunt the rugged mountain tops and river springs and meadows lush with grass? Or am I really close to people who speak my language? Up with you, see how the land lies, see for yourself now." And so again, the theme of civilization, the thing of being able to recognize other people's language as one's own, right? Of course, the term barbarism, right, or barbarian is Aristotle's term. It's the term. It's meant to sound like ba 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 ba, right? Like it's an onomatopoetic term that means somebody who doesn't speak Greek, and so that notion of the civilized person versus the barbarian is starting to show up here. We get another simile in the next passage. Muttering so, great Odysseus crept out of the bushes, stripping off with his massive hand a leafy branch from the tangled olive growth to shield his body, hide his private parts. So there's this hiding of private parts already going on. Like this is like the Genesis stories and for the Hebrews, or the Israelites at this time, is definitely around, but the concept of the nakedness and hiding nakedness seems to be with the Greeks as well. And the poet casts Odysseus like a lion here, right? So a different kind of hunter, a different kind of predator as well. Out he stalked as a mountain lion, exultant in his power, strides through wind and rain, and his eyes ablaze, and he charges sheep or oxen or chases wild deer, but his hunger drives him on to go for flocks, even to raid the best defended homestead. So Odysseus moved out, about to mingle with all these lovely girls, naked now as he was, for the need drove him on, a terrible sight, all crusted, caked in brine. They scattered in panic down the jutting beaches. Only Alcinous's daughter held fast. And we've seen this kind of thing in movies, right, and TV shows. Like, everybody runs away but the one brave person, the one who's interested, and the one who is romantically available stays. And so Alcinous stays, and she recognizes something about him, but he's of course covered in brine, and he's really nasty looking. He launched in, so Odysseus goes to speak to her. He launched in sly and suave, "Here I am at your mercy, princess. Are you a goddess or a mortal?" So again, that confusion, like, I don't know if you are one or the two, but it's also a compliment, right? If one of the gods who rule the skies up there, you're Artemis to the life. So Odysseus then attaches Nausicaa to Artemis, the daughter of mighty Zeus. I see her now. Just look at your build, your bearing, your lithe flowing grace. But if you're one of the mortals living here on earth, 3 times blessed are your father, your queenly mother. 3 times blessed are your brothers. So couched within this compliment is also this kind of recognition of family. And it's this recognition that of nobility that seems to be going on as well, even though Odysseus is naked here. He says, and then he says how blessed you're going to be, your husband's going to be true. But he is the one more blessed than all other men alive, that man who sways you with gifts and leads you home his bride. I've never laid eyes on anyone like you, neither man nor woman. I look at you and a sense of wonder takes me. So there's that kind of wondrousness that shows up in the text at the new thing. Of course, he's a sly, wily talker, Odysseus. These are character traits that he has. He knows how to woo people, or win other people's hearts. And he says, wait, once I saw the like in Delos beside Apollo's altar, the young slip of the palm tree springing into the light. There I'd sailed, you see, with a great army in my wake. Notice how he lets her know that he's leading an army, right? Out on the long campaign that doomed my life to hardship. That vision, just as I stood there gazing, rapt for hours, no shaft like that had ever risen up from the earth. So now I marvel at you, my lady, rapt enthralled, too struck with awe to grasp you by the knees, though pain has ground me down. And then he goes on to say, only yesterday, he's just journeyed for 20 days. The gods are after him, and then this moment of doubt pops in. I can't believe they'll stop, but will you please help me? Compassion, princess, please. And then he alludes again to marriage. And may the good gods give you all your heart desires, husband and house and lasting harmony too. No finer, greater gift in the world than that, when man and woman possess their home, two minds, two hearts, that work as one. Despair to their enemies, a joy to all their friends, their own best claim to glory. So he's praising marriage here, and he's the stranger, and there's the Xenia is being invoked as well. And as I mentioned earlier in 1215, for the culture I live in, Christianity wanted to contain marriages. And so before then, you might have poor people who might go like stand near the church or in front of the church and exchange vows with each other. But there was no sort of church record that was being kept. The marriages were negotiated and among nobles, right? This is what noble people do, because then women especially begin to get associated with land and with dowries and property being handed down in the Euro-Christian culture. So I want to point out that there is this marriage praise that's going on in the Odyssey, but I don't want us to be too quick to just say that the marriages that we have today, or the ways that we think about marriage in our society, is the same thing. But it's definitely there, and it's monogamous, right? Even though Odysseus has other sexual partners as well. He doesn't marry anyone else, right? Stranger, the white-armed princess answered staunchly, and I think that the white arms are going to tell us something about her nobility, right? She isn't out working in the fields all the time. She's white-armed, but she's gone out to do the laundry, or at least gone out with all of her maids to do the laundry. Friend, you're hardly a wicked man and no fool, I'd say. It's Olympian Zeus who hands out our fortunes now. And we know Athena has kind of built him up too, to make him look kind of towering and handsome and kind of rugged, and all of these great attributes. She says, Phaeacians we are who hold this city and land, and I am the daughter of generous King Alcinous. All our people's power stems from him. She called out to her girls with lovely braids. Stop, my friends. Right? They're her girls, right? They belong to her. And so that's just to let you know, and we'll see later on that that it's more explicitly noted later in the chapter. But slavery, right? So slavery is just part of the society. It's accepted by the text and the poet. It's not criticized. Surely you don't think him an enemy, do you? There's no one alive. There never will be one who'd reach Phaeacian soil and lay it waste. The immortals love us far too much for that. We live too far apart, out on the surging sea, off at the world's end. So she's telling us where she lives. No other mortals come to mingle with us. But here's an unlucky wanderer strayed our way, and we must tend him well. Every stranger and beggar comes from Zeus, and whatever scrap we give him, he'll be glad to get. And so there's that version of Xenia showing up here, but it's particularly tied to Zeus and the stranger coming into the new place. Again, nakedness shows up, and Odysseus says, "Stand where you are, dear girls, good way off, so I can rinse the brine off from my shoulders and rub myself with oil. How long it's been since the oil touched my skin, but I won't bathe in front of you. I would be embarrassed, stark naked before young girls with lovely braids." Right? So there's some gender relationships that are showing up throughout this chapter, and then it's also the marriage relationships too, right? The handmaids scurried off to tell their mistress. Zeus's daughter Athena then made him taller to all eyes. His build more massive now, and down from his brow she ran his curls like thick hyacinth clusters full of blooms. As a master craftsman washes gold over beaten silver, a man the god of fire and Queen Athena trained in every fine technique, and finishes off his latest effort, handsome work, so she lavished splendor over his head and shoulders now, and down to the beach he walked set apart. And then we get this commentary from the princess. At first he seemed appalling, I must say. Now he seems like a god who rules the skies up there. And if only a man like that were called my husband. Lived right here, pleased to stay forever. Enough, give the stranger food and drink, my girls. And I will say that, I think that there's gender hierarchy for sure going on, but this is one of the books in the Odyssey where the desires of the princess are the driving mechanism for the chapter, right? Which is interesting to have a woman who's we know that she's not going to marry Odysseus, but she doesn't necessarily know it, and she seems to be driving the plot of the chapter. Give the stranger food and drink. And then they start going back, and then she has this plan, right? So this is really interesting, like the amount of attention that is given to Nausicaa here. Wait, let's do it this way. You seem no fool to me. While we're passing along the fields and plowlands, you follow the mules and wagons, strapping briskly with all of my maids. I'll lead the way myself. And then she says, Phaeacians, you see, care nothing for bow or quiver, only for masts and oars and good trim ships themselves. We glory in our ships, crossing the foaming seas, but I shrink from all our sea dogs' nasty gossip. Some old salt might mock us behind our backs. We have our share of insolent types in town. And so we get this, there are class differences and distinctions going on here, as well as also apparently even sailors in the most ancient society had dirty mouths or dirty minds, old sea dogs. And this is all about gender and propriety, right? So around the lines 312 or so. So they'll scoff. Just think of the scandal that would face me then. I'd find fault with a girl who carried on that way, flouting her parents' wishes, father, mother, still alive, consorting with men before she'd tied the knot in public. So marriages are about public tying the knot, and they're about nobility, right? And it's about honoring parents. And no stranger, listen closely to what I say. The sooner to win your swift voyage home at my father's hands, now you'll find a splendid grove along the road, poplars sacred to Pallas, a bubbling spring inside the meadows around it. And she says, go take a seat there, wait a while, and give us time to make it into town, and then walk in yourself, and then ask for my father's house. You cannot miss it. Even an innocent child could guide you there. No other Phaeacian's house is built like that, so grand the palace of Alcinous, our great hero. Once that you're in the mansion, go directly across the hall until you reach my mother. Beside the hearth, she sits in the fire's glare, spinning yarn on a spindle, sea blue wool. And then she leans against the pillar, her ladies sit behind, and my father's throne is drawn up close beside her. There he sits and takes his wine, a mortal like a god. So again, that comparison. Go past him, grasp my mother's knees if you want to see the day of your return, rejoicing soon, even if your home's a world away. If only the queen will take you into her heart, and there's hope that you will see your loved ones reach your own grand house, your native land at last. So it's just interesting that this is very much a female-led chapter in terms of the desires of Nausicaa, and in this attention that she says, yeah, my father's there, but you need to go clasp the legs of my mother first. And the clasping of legs is definitely an ancient ritual that's going on, and there are different oaths that get swore, especially grasping kings around king's legs, and even grasping the testicles of a king as an ancient ceremony. But here, Odysseus is supposed to go win the heart of Nausicaa's mother. And so they move on, and then Athena comes and then embodies herself like an innocent child, just like Nausicaa's plan, and then leads him in. Just as he goes into the city, though, it's just note that Odysseus prays to Athena, and he says, hear me, daughter of Zeus, whose shield is thunder, tireless one Athena. Now hear my prayer at last, for you have never heard me then, when I was shattered, when the famous god of the earthquakes wrecked my craft. Grant that here among the Phaeacian people I may find some mercy and some love. So he prayed to her, but would not. Athena heard his prayer, but would not yet appear to him undisguised. So that's some foreshadowing, right? That eventually she's going to appear for him. She stood in awe of her father's brother, Lord of the sea, who seethed on, still churning. And so what we see is Athena is definitely helping him out. But the Phaeacians are kind of like Poseidon's people, right? They are the sea people. They are close to him, and they are not necessarily, the sailors are not who Odysseus should probably be hanging out with. They might do gossip. They might cause harm to this young woman, Nausicaa, who's looking for a husband. And so there are all sorts of distinctions that are showing up in class and gender, and in just the customary manner of how to interact in the houses of mobility in this little chapter, which is short, but it has packed a lot of cultural information in it. And so we'll stop there and then continue on to book 7 as Odysseus goes into Nausicaa's father's house, and we will see what happens in the next contextualized reading. Thanks for listening and paying attention, and if you're able to, please support us on Patreon. If you're getting something out of these contextualized readings or other lectures from the Center of Critical and Cultural Theory. Have a great night or day, or morning, evening, wherever you are, whenever you are. Take care.